Hey, just as a heads up, this was originally going to be a much longer project, but I've been in and out of hospital a lot over the last week or so, so please think of this video as a kind of introduction to this topic to be followed up in another part in a few weeks. Thank you. Hello, welcome to the relaxation room. Going to be popping into it occasionally throughout this video. I'm going to be covering a lot of sensitive topics in this one that are currently on screen. There. For obvious reasons, I didn't really feel like doing a silly mid-roll sponsor transition with this one. But I did want to mention that this video will be talking extensively about The Last of Us, which is also a show available on HBO Max, which is a service that thinks it's too good to be available in most of the world outside of the US. If you would like to access it, I would recommend using a VPN, and specifically Surfshark. Surfshark is a virtual private network service that helps you connect to various servers all over the globe. This is useful for online security and privacy, additional protection while using public Wi-Fi, and also accessing content that might only be available in certain countries, which is what I use it for constantly because I live inside of Dark Souls. It's also good for getting around government censorship, which could be useful if this video happens to be blocked in any countries for any reasons, with several extra features like a clean web function to help block ads, malware, trackers, and phishing attempts, and a bypasser to help you customize which apps and websites you want to have covered on the service. Surfshark is an excellent VPN and also one of the most affordable options. And if you go to surfshark.com/jsaint or use the code jsaint at checkout, you can get 4 extra months of the service. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring this video, and thank you. Just finished my replay of The Cokes of Snafusus Part 5. I actually think it was pretty underrated. Did you read the Vice article? 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 In July of 2020, writer Emanuel Myberg put out an article on Vice titled "The Not So Hidden Israeli Politics of The Last of Us Part 2." And for the past 3 years, I've been linked that article every single time I mention The Last of Us. In it, he highlights a core theme explored in the story that creative director Neil Druckmann and the team at developer Naughty Dog have been extremely subtle about. Did you know The Last of Us 2 was about cycles of violence?
I became really intrigued with the idea of the cycle of violence. That feeds right back in that idea of that cycle of violence. You know, the cycle of violence. Cycle of violence. Endless cycle of violence.
Neil walked me down the story and he was like, this cycle of violence.
Acts of violence that then would beget more acts of violence. It's almost never satisfying. It never brings the person you love back. And despite you thinking it's going to bring some closure, it doesn't. We just need more empathy. Wouldn't it be awesome if we could create an experience that lets you safely explore those feelings?
Specifically, a cycle of violence is explored by 2 key narratives woven together in the story. One, a revenge plot between 2 characters, and one, an ongoing back and forth conflict between 2 armies wrestling for control of a post-apocalyptic Seattle. Sorry, I was trying to think of a good joke about Seattle. When I went there were not enough public restrooms.
Rather than step back, cooperate, and seek truth and reconciliation, the Wolves and Scars keep seeking revenge for past grievances in a cycle of violence that eventually ends them both in literal fires sparked by hate. The game's message seems to be, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind.
And yeah, this message in the story is about as blunt as the writers of the game directly stating it. As Myberg points out, there is literally a part of the game where, as an act of revenge, one of the characters has their eye shot out. Throughout the story, revenge is consistently shown as foolish and destructive, both obviously to the person receiving it, but also the person inflicting it. Death and death and death and loneliness and misery, and it is only on these few occasions of a character demonstrating mercy that we see any possible glimmer of hope. Now clearly, you can't really tie this type of story to any specific modern politics. The cycle of violence and revenge as a storytelling idea is pretty old. And I don't just mean like Shakespeare old, although Shakespeare definitely used that trope in a lot of his work. Hamlet, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, King Lear, Titus Andronicus, all of these stories are driven by acts of violence that spin off into more violence, and most of the time everyone ends up dead. Much older religious and mythological stories use this trope. The story of Saturn, which I mentioned in my last video, is entirely built on a god assuring his own destruction through his own violent acts. Acts which were ironically meant to protect Saturn from that fate. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known stories, centers around a feud between a violent, oppressive king and a group of enraged gods, leading to the death of his BFF Vegeta boyfriend. Only at the end of the story is Gilgamesh's violent nature quelled and he resigns himself to a quieter, humble life. Kind of like another story. This leaves us with a question. What does this have to do with Israel? Is this just a case of people taking current controversial political topics and projecting it onto the themes of a much more universal story? Or even just extrapolating that because the lead writer of the game is from Israel, that therefore means everything he writes necessarily has to be about Israel? To answer this question, I want to rewind back to the initial hype cycle leading up to The Last of Us 2's release.
Who's this woman? Who is this faction? Like, what's going on?
Who the fuck has time to hang someone?
This was the second trailer released for the game, and the first one to give a clearer sense of what it was about. Notably, not just about Joel and Ellie, the protagonists of the previous entry in the series, from whose perspectives everything that happened in that story was observed from. Fans pretty much immediately started speculating this mysterious new character must therefore have some direct connection to Joel and Ellie. And I remember at the time, the big theory people landed on was that this was going to turn out to be Ellie's mum, something Druckmann and his team directly fed into.
The same number of letters as Anna, Ellie's mom's name, will get people to think this is Ellie's mom.
And it would make some sense to go in this direction. Much of the first game centered around Ellie's miraculous immunity from the spores that had infected most of the planet, and this would be an opportunity to provide some backstory to that immunity. It just so happens that theory was completely wrong. What the trailer actually depicts is a soldier named Abby being captured by members of an unknown religious cult. At least that's what we can assume based on their references to the soldier's sins and their search to root out an apostate of their faith. The soldier is teased with mutilation and strung up to be lynched before being narrowly saved, presumably by the same people the cult was looking for, during which members of the cult are summarily executed. With hindsight, it's actually pretty telling that this was the scene the game was sold with, and if you know what I'm talking about, you know where I'm going with this. See, Druckmann actually had a very specific idea of what inspired him with this story.
And then they cheered afterward. Druckmann, who grew up in Israel, recalls. It was the cheering that was really chilling to me. In my mind, I thought, oh man, if I could just push a button and kill all these people that committed this horrible act, I would make them feel the same pain that they inflicted on these people.
In a 2020 interview with the Washington Post, Druckmann, who'd spent much of his childhood in Tel Aviv, outlined his reaction to an infamous 2000 lynching in Ramallah, an occupied West Bank territory, specifically the killing of 2 Israeli soldiers to the gleeful celebration of a Palestinian crowd. He highlights 2 feelings. First, disgust at the crowd and an immediate wish that he could have pushed a button to instantly kill them all as vengeance, and then later disgust at himself for having had that reaction. In his own words, as much as the first Last of Us was born out of his love for his child, The Last of Us 2 would be an exploration of the hate he felt towards those Palestinians. So yeah, I guess I can see how some people thought maybe this game was about Israel. So here we have a story about cycles of violence, 2 warring factions, neither of which is willing to let go of their grudge against the other. One is presented as a drab, modern, militaristic group of coldly pragmatic soldiers securing their territory, while one is presented as a backwards, bloodthirsty, primitive, intolerant religious group who mutilate themselves and their enemies. I wonder which one is meant to be Palestine. Now I could end this video here by saying you can just go read Meyerberg's article and come to your own conclusions. But look buddy, I have a YouTube channel here, and I don't know if you know this, but I'm actually going to be a father. And to be honest, I've been wanting to talk about Zionism and also about The Last of Us for quite a long time. And I think it also makes sense to explore both of those things in their full context to better understand how they really link together. So given the release of the 2nd season of The Last of Us show and Israel, I'd like to talk to you all about Zionism and The Last of Us. So first let's talk about The Last of Us.
Oh my god.
Dude!
It's weed.
Dude! Yes, dude! Oh my god, yes, dude! Game of the year, dude! Game of the year, dude! Dude, can I smoke the weed, dude?
The funny thing is, I played The Last of Us Part 2 on release and had originally planned to make a video about it when it came out. There was also going to talk about politics. Not these
You
politics.
could see Ellie used to be a bit of a more cute girl, and now in the new game, she's looking more angry, more masculine, more male. And eventually, we're going to get to one of our famous, most hated SJWs of all time. Anita Sarkeesian appears to play a role in this.
There's a question I want you to think about as we go through this video. Is it always better to keep things simple? The Last of Us has always been a controversial series, although I'd argue the first and second one were controversial for kind of different reasons. The first game, for the most part, kept things simple. It was very self-consciously basically a HBO drama miniseries long before it was actually a HBO drama miniseries. It is a serious, gritty, grounded story, and they want you to know that so bad that the title of the making of documentary is also grounded. Grounded. There's a good chance you've already seen a story about a gruff older man trying to navigate an apocalypse. There's a chance you've already seen one about a man escorting other survivors to the possibility of salvation. There's a chance you've already seen one where specifically the man is escorting a child, and there's a chance you've already seen one where specifically the man is escorting a child who may also hold the key to a special cure. If you have also noticed The Last of Us is somewhat derivative, ooh, what a special boy you are. Now don't get me wrong, I also wish they'd just stuck with the original concept of a Jak and Daxter sequel. I don't see what's so unapproachable about a story about an elf and his talking weasel traveling through time to a dystopian future so they can use special cosmic energy to fight fascism while also battling an invading alien army, and also there's some evil robots who are fascists and alien.
You're in for a big surprise. The Darkmakers don't play nicely with others. Just ask the metalheads.
So true. They also hunt dinosaurs. Maybe this should have just been a Yes album. I think it's always been clear it wasn't a mistake that The Last of Us mostly follows a very recognizable narrative structure. It's, again, approachable, especially to people who don't often play games, and that extends to every aspect of the design. The game's focus is clearly on immaculately presented worlds and characters with impressive art, sound, animation, and performances, while the gameplay is kept relatively simple and, again, focused on cinematic moments. Some people find this fluid and natural, while some people think it's basically a game that's vaguely ashamed of being a game and thinks it's better than everyone else because it's like, dude, what if the guys in the computer are like real human beings?
Evie's fucking dead!
There's always been, to an extent, a popular idea that video games are toys for children, or at the very least an inherently lowbrow form of art if it's even considered art. And as a result, it's never quite sat well with some people that The Last of Us has been so widely elevated for basically doing as much as it can to avoid acknowledging as a video game. Like it's vaguely ashamed of its own medium. I've always found that take somewhat cynical. Part of what I love about games is that they can merge so many different elements from other mediums. Is it slightly cringe that so much more money and attention is given to games that are vaguely trying to be movies? Sure. Does it feel slightly patronizing when the game stops every 30 minutes to give me a zombie encounter so my little gamer brain doesn't wither away and die? A bit. Is it really pretentious that writers keep refusing to call their zombies zombies? Yes, it is. Please stop doing this. You already wrote zombies in. You can't just trick us at the last second by calling them the deady, walky, frowny men. But it works. And even if it feels derivative, I think their first story was well executed. Joel and Ellie perfectly reflect on each other in ways that aren't immediately apparent. This is not Joel's world. That world is gone. That future he had is gone. And Ellie is just a reminder of that lost innocence that went with it. At the same time, Ellie was born into this world. She's been robbed of that past Joel used to enjoy, a father she didn't get to have. But she does get to have him, and he gets to have her if the two are willing to let go of their significant personal emotional baggage.
I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you.
The way they do feels so gradual that I really struggle not to get invested in it. It's ironically far better executed here than in the show adaptation the game eventually got. But all this has to be shrunk down to a 9-episode season where 3 episodes lack one or both lead characters and most of the others dedicate huge chunks of time to side character B-plots. I'll talk about the show in a bit. In the end, the story revolves around one basic question. In a game called The Last of Us, who is us? Who do we prioritize? Who are we willing to make sacrifices for, and how far are we willing to go? At one point, Joel and Ellie cross paths with an obvious mirror of themselves in brothers Henry and Sam, family who've already committed to lives devoted to protecting one another. When Sam is infected and Henry's forced to kill him, Henry immediately concludes he has nothing else to live for and kills himself. Later, Ellie encounters a group of starving survivors whose leaders have turned to cannibalism to maintain peace and order. And you can see in both Joel and Ellie a struggle to be vulnerable enough to recognize how strongly they feel about each other. I was always really struck by the last section of the game leading up to Joel handing Ellie over to the Fireflies. This weird role reversal moment where Joel has finally opened up and just starts chatting away about things to do with Ellie when all this is over, wanting to teach her how to play a guitar, even opening up somewhat about losing his first child, Sarah.
After you lost Sarah?
Yes, it will.
I can't imagine losing someone you love like that. Losing everything that you know. I'm sorry, Joel.
That's okay, Ellie.
And you can sense this quiet discomfort in Ellie, almost like she's not quite prepared for this new daughter role Joel now clearly has lined up for her. In the end, Joel is forced to make a decision between Ellie and a cure that could be the potential salvation of the human race. He chooses Ellie. She is his us. Again, it's a fairly straightforward story presented in an easily approachable cinematic way, and some people connected with it and some people didn't. Most of that criticism was more about general frustrations with the direction of the game industry, and not as much controversy around the story of the game itself. This was not the case with The Last of Us Part 2.
I don't give a fuck. I'll do the whole thing on my own.
Hey, welcome back to the relaxation room. Thought it'd be good for us to spend a few moments in here before we move on. I just want to say that whether or not you like a video game, I think you're a cool guy, because you made it this far in the video, and that is an accomplishment. And you know, I'd like to say I've mellowed out about the outrage around The Last of Us 2 in the 5 years since it came out. And you know, I'm a chill guy now, and I get where people are coming from. No. So as Druckmann explained, The Last of Us Parts 1 and 2 are kind of mirrors of each other. The first game is an exploration of love, and the second an exploration of hate. Tying it together thematically, if the first Last of Us was mostly focused on the process of learning to love and trust another person, the act of bringing someone into our hearts and the consequences of that, The Last of Us 2 is about losing that, about what happens when the people we love are taken from us, when The Last of Us is gone. A lot of people did not like this.
10 hours of Abby? 10?
Mel's pregnant.
And we're gonna play as Abby some more? Are you fucking kidding me?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
No, fuck Abby, I don't want to play as this. This is exactly as I thought it was! Fuck this!
The Last of Us Part 2 is the last Jedi of gaming.
I remember in the months of online arguments about how The Last of Us 2 betrayed the original story, I saw this video essay by The Closer Look that a lot of people recommended, where he not only explains some of the issues people had, but even goes as far as to present a complete rewrite of the story in a way that would better please fans. And many fans who hated the second game story did like the rewrite. It's why I was sent the video. I feel like breaking down this rewrite in contrast to the second game is probably a more fun way to talk about The Last of Us 2 than just a long dry summary next to some angry tweets, so we're gonna do that. So to briefly catch up, in the actual game Joel dies abruptly in the first few hours, spoiling the opportunity to mend the relationship between himself and Ellie following his decision at the end of the first game. His killer is Abby, motivated by Joel's own brutal murder of her dad and the complete massacre of the group she was a part of. Ellie's quest for revenge leads her to deliberately killing some of Abby's friends while accidentally killing others, including Abby's on-off lover Owen and his pregnant partner Mel. Abby inflicts her own revenge, killing Ellie's friend Jesse and maiming Joel's brother Tommy. And when she spares Ellie, Ellie still cannot let it go. It is only finally, after tracking Abby down one last time, moments away from drowning her and finally ending this feud, that Ellie remembers that last interaction she had with Joel before his death. The moment we later learn that she tells him even though she's not sure she can forgive him, she wants to try. Ellie for a moment allows herself to think of Abby the way she thought of Joel. She lets Abby in. She lets Abby live. They are left bloodied and scarred, but they both walk away. It's over.
Ellie lets her walk free. You let Joel's killer walk free. This is terrible storytelling. To not even decide to pay it off, you let his killer walk free. I'm not playing the game.
Well, what the fuck was the point in this then?
So in the Closer Looks rewrite, Joel doesn't actually die. Instead, Abby just shoots his leg and kidnaps Ellie's girlfriend Dina, thinking she's Ellie, because it turns out somehow Fedra returned. Fedra being the fascist military group that was basically falling apart in the last game.
They're led by a man we'll call General Redgrave, someone who before the infection was actually a general in the US Army and served in Iraq. What's really terrifying about this guy is he doesn't give monologues, he doesn't have an ego, he won't order people tortured just for the fun. He is purely tactical, logical, and is a ruthlessly brilliant commander.
But now they have helicopters and zombie death squads, and they even have a cure, but it's like a shitty diet cure that only really works if you're already infected, and if you get infected again, you need to use it again, which, I mean, it definitely sounds like a headache. So that's actually the reason Abby was tracking down Joel and Ellie, to try and get a better cure to undermine Fedra. Not for any kind of personal reason.
That's why Abby and her crew went to Jackson, because if they can use Ellie to find a way to create a permanent cure, like one where you take a single shot and that's it, you're immune from the cordyceps forever, it will break General Redgrave's grip and all the other local factions, as his cure, which is what's giving him all of his influence, will suddenly be worthless. Doesn't this version of Abby sound so much more compelling as a character compared to the one we got?
Ellie goes after Dina and crosses paths with Abby, who deliberately gets Dina infected, so Ellie is forced to join forces with her and help make the cure to save America from Fedra domination. Along the way, Ellie has a phone, so she can occasionally call Joel and he can give her advice, and they actually get to resolve a lot of their personal issues.
And she tells Joel everything, that she's been blackmailed, that Dina's been infected, and Ellie's never felt more alone and afraid in all her life. And Joel consoles her without skipping a beat, telling her what to do, to not trust Abby because people like her always go back on their word, to remember all the lessons he taught her, and to leave these people and their politics alone and come home with Dina the first second she can. And Ellie finally asks, after all this time, she finally asks how he's doing.
Up to the point where Abby betrays Ellie, because it turns out they actually still can't make the cure without killing her. Luckily, Joel shows up with a wooden leg and rescues her. So then they team up to save Dina and get their revenge on Abby, and just as Ellie does save Dina, Abby shows up and almost kills her. And then Joel rescues her again. So the twist is that right as Joel and Ellie's relationship seems to be mended, Dina gives Ellie the diet cure to take away her immunity, and then frames Joel for it. So Ellie ditches Joel, and Joel decides to go kill Abby, which I guess is just a way to keep some semblance of the revenge story so this still vaguely feels like the same game. Anyway, Ellie figures out Dina was lying, and Joel does kill Abby, but he's also mortally wounded, and as the game closes out, Ellie finds Joel just in time for one final heartfelt conversation, presumably a few feet away from Abby's floating corpse.
Ellie runs towards him and immediately tries to stop the bleeding, begging for him to hold on. She says it was Dina who did it, and she begs for his forgiveness. Joel forgives her instantly, and he makes her promise to be strong, to look after the people at Jackson, because he can't anymore. He tells her to remember all of the lessons that he taught her, and she promises to. That's my girl, he says weakly.
Joel gets to tell Ellie to remember all of his lessons, and Ellie gets to apologize for all the terrible things she said to him. And just as he passes away, Ellie calls him Dad. We close out on a teaser of the Fedra general preparing to invade America, and that's what The Last of Us Part 3 would be.
Then General Redgrave looking at the remnants of the battle and saying something like, "Let's get to work."
I really respect that The Closer Look took the time to not just have a knee-jerk fuck this reaction to a story he disliked, but to actually think through why he disliked it and what he would have done differently. I also want to underline that, I have no personal beef with The Closer Look, and I generally believe that there's no such thing as a bad story, just bad execution. With that said, I fucking hate this. So now instead of a story about two characters with deeply personal motivations, tragically entangled as each sees the other as the root of their problems, descending into the worst versions of themselves as each refuses to understand or recognize the humanity of the other, Ellie and Abby are effectively set dressing for a story about the big bad evil empire showing up and forcing them to join forces. Until at the last second, Joel shows up to wrap up the conflict for an emotional climax that amounts to, "I love you, Joel. We all love you, Joel. Just double checking nobody playing has to struggle with any possible unresolved emotions. Get hyped for War for the Planet of The Last of Us."
And then at the end of this full exploration of their relationship, when they finally resolve their angst and Ellie's forgiven him, then Joel dies. Almost nobody would have had a problem with that. This is why people pulling out the argument of, oh, you're just annoyed because they killed a character you love, doesn't hold much water.
I think my problem is rooted in how the closer look characterizes the first game as a heartwarming story about an old man learning to love again.
The first game is all about Joel, the cynical old man, meeting Ellie, the naive, optimistic girl, and the story follows them both as they fall in love, as they grow to trust each other, and both of them improve the other. That's what the first game was all about, this heartwarming tale of paternal love. But if The Last of Us 1 wasn't about that, and was instead about a miserable man struggling to survive in the apocalypse, meeting a girl and then dragging her down to his level, then making her equally as depraved a person as him, if the first game were far darker and far bleaker than what we got, the response to this second one would have been immeasurably more positive.
So, okay, to some extent it was the first thing. But it was also definitely the second thing.
Those goddamn years I took care of us.
Took care? That's what you call it? I got nothing but nightmares from those years.
You survived because of me.
I told you what you wanted. I ain't telling you shit.
That's all right. I believe him.
No, wait!
In fact, the second thing defined the entire last act of the original game and is referenced constantly throughout the second. When Ellie tortures one of Abby's friends for information, she is emulating Joel in the first game. When Ellie tries to get Owen and Mel to cross-check a location on a map, she is emulating Joel in the first game. So much of the second game revolves around Ellie's resentment towards Joel, as explored by the pain she goes through when she tries to do for Joel what she knows he would have done for her. That's the whole thing. And in fairness, I feel like the show also flubs this pretty hard with this weird obsession Craig Mazin has with Ellie being some secret sadist who craves torture and murder.
Because when she's in that moment and she's got his arm and he's tapping out, she's somewhere else. Ellie is not like Joel. Joel builds. Ellie doesn't build stuff. She doesn't do construction. But Ellie can do violence.
Watch this scene and tell me Ellie is in any way enjoying what she's doing.
I made her talk.
And I do want to emphasize, I mean the creative team behind the show adaptation when I criticize this. Bella Ramsey has gotten such absurd out of proportion flack despite already demonstrating their talent with their performance as Ellie in the first season. The point is, Ellie cares for Joel just as players most likely do, but that doesn't prevent her from recognizing he was often a cruel and callous person who was extremely quick to decide whose lives had value and whose didn't. This does not make Joel a fundamentally evil person, and clearly nobody, including the developers, including Neil Druckmann, thought of Joel that way, because the ending of the game is a flashback about Ellie wanting to forgive him. In fact, Joel ultimately dies because he is willing to put himself in danger to help save the lives of strangers, something he never would have done without Ellie's influence. It's not hard to see why he'd feel particularly inclined to save Abby, another young woman of a similar age to Ellie with quite a few similar surface characteristics. The tragedy isn't that Joel is unable to change his nature, but that letting his guard down makes him vulnerable to people who are as brutal and merciless as he used to be.
Joel is not that dumb. Joel is very smart. Joel is intelligent. And you made him out to be an idiot.
That's Abby's role in the story, to be a reflection both on how Joel used to think and what Ellie will become if she follows that same path. Which is why it's so devastating to see Ellie go down that path anyway, and why it's cathartic to see both of them finally choose a different option. Throughout this video, the closer look makes several references to making characters more compelling, and I'm really fascinated how he is defining compelling. Because I would say a compelling character is one whose personality and behaviors are explored to the extent that we see extremes both of their best aspects and their worst, and how maybe even sometimes those two are tragically linked. This is part of what complicates Ellie's relationship with Joel. His behaviors didn't come from some cliche, sadistic, dark passenger. They came from his desire to protect people. This is the point. The things we often value most in people, love and empathy and loyalty, can often lead us to doing truly depraved things out of those feelings of obligation. I almost took an AI sponsorship, which is basically as bad as setting a man on fire. I guess being compelling here just means having obnoxious traits that make characters memorable while having no meaningful impact on the story or its message.
She gives Kyle a boost over a ledge, but then he doesn't lift her up and says that she'll have to find her own way round. Ellie sees a badass looking gun, and we get the player really excited about getting this and playing with it, and they have to do a puzzle to access it. And then once the player completes the puzzle and goes to claim it, Kyle beats them to it, and then he claims it for himself. And this really pisses the player off. And also, they constantly bicker about who should be the one who rides the horse. All of a sudden, Kyle is a far more compelling supporting character.
What if Jesse was Dina's annoying brother who hated Ellie but then dies trying to save her? That's an arc. What if Dina, who spends the entire game being a damsel in distress, decides she wants to completely destroy Ellie's relationship with Joel because it's compelling? And I really do not get how Abby is made more compelling by completely erasing all of her relationships, so that instead her entire plot is built around the most generic, literal, mustache-twirling villainous force. So Joel can come back, take away her role in the story entirely, and then she can unceremoniously die. And then, in a story that is seemingly built thematically around Joel recognizing Ellie as an adult woman with their own autonomy, she constantly needs to consult with him for advice, if not needing him to actively save her repeatedly days after having his leg blown to smithereens. Remember in the winter chapter of the last game where it seems like it's setting up Joel saving Ellie at the last second, but then she actually manages to save herself and he only appears in time to console her after she was forced to make her own hard choices? Fuck that. And all of this to serve an exact retread of the last game's moral quandary about whether Ellie is willing to sacrifice herself for a cure, where the twist is she still doesn't get to make any choices because she has to mistakenly think Joel made the choice for her, because the entire story needs to bend around the most important thing: Joel and how he feels, and the audience getting as much time as humanly possible to pay tribute to him and his lessons. Reminder, this is the version of The Last of Us 2 that many fans wish they'd gotten instead. The only consolation that I can find in all this is that I'm glad I had an excuse to use the word smithereens. The Closer Looks alternative is not a simpler story in its plot. I'd actually argue it's way more convoluted, with a narrative now splitting main character roles between Ellie, Abby, and Joel, while also expanding to balance not just two main factions, but also make room for a third objectively evil one, as well as introducing a new scientist with a new cure and a plot to take over America. It's a good thing you used a Call of Duty character to represent the villain here, because I think you just wrote a Call of Duty game. But while it isn't a narratively simpler game, it is a simpler story emotionally.
The revenge story only works if there's a bad guy to get revenge on, someone that the protagonist and the audience really wants to see dead because they're just such a bastard. In John Wick, the guy who killed his dog is the bad guy. Nothing more, nothing less. And when John aims at Theon but chooses to spare him because death by bullet is just too quick, we as the audience get a great big grin on our faces because we want to see what kind of horrific slow death John has in mind, because the bad guy is just so detestable. Because if we did start to like the bad guy, it would undermine how much we want to see John get his revenge. Therefore, it would undermine the audience's engagement with the story. Therefore, the story would be less entertaining.
It's notable that even when The Closer Look tries to reintegrate the game's museum flashback, he completely misconstrues its role as levity in a dark story.
And that flashback we got in the actual game, where Ellie and Joel go to that museum and get in that space capsule, we have that here, exactly the same as it is in the game. We see how much they enjoyed each other's company company. But as the flashback comes to a close, it ends with the younger Ellie smiling at the dinosaur statue, and we see how much Ellie misses those days, how nostalgic she is for them, just like the player is. In this story, that flashback does more than just act as a moment of levity in a dark story. It reminds the player exactly what Ellie used to have.
That's not what that scene was. That's not even what the exact clip you're showing right now is. In that clip, Ellie is looking at graffiti of the word liars underneath the logo of the Fireflies, the faction used in most of the first game to represent hope. So what does it tell us? That immediately after Joel sets up a perfect birthday for Ellie, filled with fantasy and imagination, she finds herself in some hidden dark corner that reminds her of everything Joel asked her to forget and walk away from, which he then immediately does again as soon as he sees her looking at it, because those are the complicated feelings Ellie is struggling with. She loves Joel, but she also knows there are things buried inside him that terrify her and make her feel like everything else is just another constructed fantasy. And in the end, it is her who pays the consequences for those parts of him he was scared to show, because through that love, those parts of him become parts of her.
The things that no matter what, this game can't be a good sequel, not necessarily be a bad story, but be a bad sequel if they aren't thoroughly explored. The relationship between Ellie and Joel would have taken the #1 spot, but it can't be explored because Joel's dead. Yes, some of the flashbacks did help to alleviate this issue, but they only give us a minimal exploration of Ellie's and Joel's relationship. But it can't be explored. But it can't be explored. But it can't be explored. A minimal exploration. A minimal exploration. A minimal exploration.
But yeah, man, way better if it's just a nostalgic reminder of how much we liked the first game. Maybe in the next one, like Bill and Tess could show up and help Ellie take down Mecha Marlene. This isn't just a story being dark for the sake of being dark. You know what is? A whole subplot built around the body horror of finding experimental clicker people begging to be killed.
So Ellie grabs a pen and paper, gives it to the woman, she scribbles something down, and Ellie looks at the paper to see the words, "Kill me." God, I am so messed up as a human being. Like, I am not right in the head, but that would be bloody horrendous and bloody lovely at the same time.
You gamers are just too stupid to understand this very high IQ game. I'm so sick of this shit, man. Abby is not morally grey. She's comically fucking evil. Caring about Lev does not make up for the shit she's done, not even close. Morally grey? Lol. Both Abby and Ellie are fucking homicidal psychopaths who slaughter men and women across Seattle and beyond. What is morally grey about that? Furthermore, why would you want to empathize? Jack Saint is an idiot. Who is this Can you stop being a contrarian because the game was written by someone you agree with politically for one goddamn minute? If they can't be heroic, they aren't morally grey, they're just villains. Are you really this stupid? I got a lot of shit online for the frustrations I had about the outrage around The Last of Us 2. It made me feel at the time like maybe games are just toys for instant gratification. Because usually when I listen to a sad song or watch a sad scene in a movie, I don't need to explain that sometimes art that is trying to entertain you will also intentionally make you feel negative emotions. I don't think Titanic would be improved if I asked the AI to rewrite a version of it where Jack can actually fit on the door. This is incidentally where I would put my AI sponsorship, if I had one. But in retrospect, I do think that is dismissive. I get how frustrating it is when you're trying to explain you don't like something, not because it made you feel bad, but because of the way it was executed. Not long ago I made a video about Smile where I kept trying to explain my issues with that movie weren't just about it making me feel negative emotions, but the context of what the story was using those feelings to express. And I don't doubt there are plenty of people who feel that way about The Last of Us 2. I've also had issues with The Last of Us 2 that I will be talking about. And if it was just that Joel was your comfort character and his death made you feel too miserable to want to continue that story, that's also completely fine. What I didn't understand, what I still don't understand, is the idea that any of this is at odds with what the first Last of Us was already about. Now, having distance from it, it's easy enough to say people just have different opinions on a video game and who fucking cares. It is hard to remove this situation from the degree that, at the time of its release, a certain percentage of people online really were huge fucking babies about it.
I'm not playing the game.
As someone who at the time loved the first game, I pretty much knew everything about this twist and what happened in it weeks before the sequel came out, because the instant it was leaked, people were so upset they immediately screen capped it and sent it as wide as possible, ruining any possibility for huge chunks of the audience to experience that moment within the context of the game's actual narrative. Now, it's understandable that outside of that context, reduced to vague bullet points, it's a less compelling story in the way every story is less compelling when reduced to bullet points. I don't doubt what the closer look imagined in his head while explaining his rewrite is actually pretty cool, even if outlining it here makes me want to die. Within that context, I think it fits perfectly with what the series has always been about: how we decide whose lives matter and how we treat those who aren't a part of our tribe. It's also hard to get around the fact that, yeah, a lot of people were specifically mad about Joel's death because he was killed by a big muscly lady who may or may not be trans.
Not only does the game have this lesbian love story at the forefront, it's being led by Ellie, who's an alphabet character, but also there's another alphabet looking character who has killed our favorite main character, Joel, and it's turned it into this whole progressive baloney.
Now, in the end, it turned out there was a different trans character, and I honestly kind of resent them feeling the need to literally show Abby sleeping between a gym and a cattle farm to justify her gains. But this is still why you'll see people point to this game as a forced wokeness story and use Joel as an example of the endless diminishment of brave straight white men.
This whole game is a fucking message, dude. It's retarded. Kill off all the male characters to keep the female. Somebody's got to say it at this point. To keep the female. Idiot.
At one point I was going to do a whole section on this, but I mean, fucking who cares at this point? I mean, I hope I've done an okay job explaining why it makes sense for the story to go in this direction if you've been misled into thinking it's just this haphazard pandering thing. If you still want to argue about it, I don't know, man. It honestly feels like the wokeness is dead crowd just try to come up with literally anything to get upset about at this point. And I really don't want to waste time trying to convince people who will never accept anything that doesn't fit their own confirmation bias. Just as a reminder, this is the image of me you need to post so everyone knows I'm a cuck. None of this is to say The Last of Us 2 is a perfect game. I gave it a 6. What I didn't like about it was partly how stretched out large chunks of it felt to satisfy expectations of like a Last of Us experience. The pacing, in my opinion, was kind of atrocious, with a lot of sudden stops in narrative tension and momentum for obligatory generic stealth action gameplay. But underneath that, I always felt there was a deeper issue with the philosophy behind these games. Something that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Not about the game being too dark or serious or political, but what it imagines a dark, serious, political game is. In 2009, it was announced a tactical shooter would be released based on a battle that took place during the Iraq War from the perspective of US troops. 6 days in Fallujah. The game immediately became highly controversial, with various arguments why its development was in bad taste. That the conflict was too recent, they would be biased towards a pro-American agenda, they would lack the ability to provide necessary context to the situation when limited to the format of action shooter gameplay. This, I feel, was the basic anxiety underlying this, that given how obviously political a game like this would be, lacking the emotional distance we might have to older conflicts like the First and Second World Wars that had frequently been the basis of games, a shooter was not equipped to tackle this. On its face, I disagree that a game couldn't be used to portray a real, deeply sensitive or controversial topic. Obligatory Spec Ops: The Line reference. I do think some people had a knee-jerk reaction to seeing a game that had a surface-level similarity to Call of Duty, a franchise that in fairness has repeatedly collaborated directly with the US military, and has historically not been especially sensitive to the ways it depicts military conflict. This comes back to what I was talking about before, the perception of games as toys for the gratification of an audience. How could people be expected to play a game based on a real-life conflict from a real-life war that was premised on an illegal invasion of a country and the commitment of repeated, well-documented war crimes, and not just come away thinking, I just got an epic headshot. Now, people said epic a lot in 2009, I was just being historically accurate. The developers' initial statements seemed very clear their desire to depoliticize an obviously political event, something that just feels patently ridiculous when the basis of your game is US Marines asking you to retell an event from their point of view to better understand their perspective.
A recreation of the actual events the actual stories of the Marines that fought in Fallujah. Our role is to tell the true stories of what happened in Fallujah, as told to us by the people who were actually there.
It reminded me of the recent movie Warfare, which also depicted a real battle during the Iraq War and has gotten a lot of criticism, but at least to me felt clearly framed in a way that underlined what a pointless waste of life this entire invasion was, and at least explicitly highlighted the dehumanizing attitudes encouraged in US troops. This is something anyone who wants to depict such an event should be aware of, not to try and remove themselves from that responsibility. And that leads me back to thinking about The Last of Us and its relationship to politics. Again, I'm not of the opinion that games can't be used to address serious topics. Clearly in The Last of Us, there was an aspiration to use games to reflect more than escapist fun and instant gratification. By the second game, there's efforts to characterize even the most minor enemy NPCs with names and relationships to make the player feel the weight of this story as it unfolds. And some players, again, resisted this, resenting being made to feel guilty for trying to enjoy what was, at its core, a third-person shooter. There were also disappointing engine limitations. I can't be the only person who on a few occasions tried to hold an enemy hostage or force them to flee or surrender without having to kill them, and at least from my experience found it impossible to have it play out that way. But this isn't your story. It's Ellie's. And even if the game does encourage you to engage emotionally with your actions, the guilt is Ellie's. For all these reasons, in development and execution, in thematic and narrative intent, I think The Last of Us, and especially its sequel, wants to make real statements about real moral issues that genuinely concern people. And I do feel it's basically equipped to do that. And that is why we ask, can The Last of Us tell us anything about Zionism? Okay, so you can see we're back in the relaxation room here, and that means we have to chill. So this may be abrupt, but I may have scheduled these videos without really thinking about what would happen if while making them, my partner went into labor, and suddenly I had a lot less time to work on this video. So this is actually part one of a multi-part series that will be talking about Zionism and The Last of Us. This part was mostly focused on The Last of Us, and then the second part will be talking more about Israel and Zionism, and then connecting it back to a lot of the things that we've talked about in this video. I'll also be giving more thoughts about the show adaptation, and then kind of relating that back to the games. I am genuinely sorry if this feels kind of disjointed. Again, I really did just overextend myself. I do hope this was at least a solid introduction to this topic. If you like this video and you want to be notified when part 2 drops, you can subscribe, bell button, or if you want to support the channel directly, you can become a patron, and then you'll be in the credits that are scrolling by now. There's also Ko-fi for tips and stuff, or become a YouTube member stuff. Thank you all for watching. I love you all, and always remember that when you're looking for when you're in the darkness, always make sure to look for the like button. Can I get a fucking pinata? Who do I need to surf to get a taquingo? I go on holidays. That's something I do.